Picture this. You own a company that literally holds up America. Every bridge you drive across, every skyscraper you walk into, every warship defending this country. All of it. Your steel, your people, your empire. You've got 300,000 employees. You're building a ship every single day. The government can't fight a war without you. Builders can't build without you. So here's the question. How does a company like that just disappear? Completely. Bankruptcy. Liquidation. 95,000 retirees left with nothing. There was no corruption. No scandal. No idiot CEO who gambled it all away. What there was a perfect storm of forces that nobody saw coming. And today, we're going to break down exactly how giants died. 1857, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Let's start not with greatness, but with ordinariness. A small outfit called Sakona Iron Company is incorporated along the banks of the Lehigh River. They're making iron rails for railroads. Boring, repetitive work. Thousands of companies just like it all across the country. Nothing special. The town of Bethlehem itself was founded over a century earlier by Moravian settlers. A quiet, religious community built around a church and a sense of order. Population maybe a few thousand. Clean air. Church bells marking the hours. Then the furnaces came, and everything changed. Within a few years, the company reorganizes as Bethlehem Iron Company. The rhythm of the town shifts from church bells to shift whistles. The sky takes on a permanent haze. Workers arrive from across Pennsylvania, then from across Europe. Irish, Welsh, Hungarian, Slovak, German. They come because the furnaces are always hiring. But here's the thing about location. The Lehigh River Valley wasn't chosen randomly. It had everything a metalworks needed. Coal deposits in the nearby mountains. Iron ore accessible by canal and rail. Water power from the river. And transportation routes to Philadelphia, New York, the entire East Coast. Geography is destiny. And Bethlehem Iron had geography on its side. By the 1880s. They're producing about 60,000 tons of iron rails annually. Solid business. Steady contracts. Nothing extraordinary. But iron has a problem. It's strong enough for rails, but not strong enough for what's coming. The future needs steel. 1886. This is the pivot point. The moment everything changes, the United States Navy puts out a request for proposals. They need armor plate for warships. Not just any steel, naval armor, capable of withstanding the new generation of artillery that's being developed in Europe. Think about the technical challenge here. You need steel plate 12 inches thick, sometimes thicker. It has to be uniform in composition. No weak spots, no impurities, because a single flaw means a shell penetrates and kills sailors. The tolerances are tighter than anything in civilian industry. The temperature's higher. The forging pressure's enormous. Most companies looked at the Navy contract and said, too difficult, too risky. Bethlehem Iron said, we'll do it. They won the bid. And then they had to actually figure out how to do it. New forging presses were installed. Massive hydraulic machines capable of exerting 14,000 tons of pressure. That's 28 million pounds of force. Enough to reshape solid steel like it's clay. New furnaces designed to reach 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Hot enough to make steel flow like water. The workforce was retrained. Engineers were brought in from Europe where armor plate technology was more advanced. The entire company reorganized around this single contract. And here's what matters. This wasn't temporary. Bethlehem Iron internalized military production as a core competency. They learned how to think in terms of government relationships, strategic materials, national security. They learned how to make themselves indispensable. By 1899, When the company reorganized as Bethlehem Steel Company, they were producing armor plate not just for the U.S. Navy, but for navies around the world. Russian battleships, Chilean cruisers, Japanese destroyers that would later fight in the Russo-Japanese War. The lesson they learned: the most durable market advantage isn't efficiency or price. It's necessity. If the government needs you, they'll pay you. If they need you badly enough, they'll pay whatever you ask. This insight would carry Bethlehem Steel to extraordinary heights. It would also eventually become a trap. 1903. Charles M. Schwab takes control of Bethlehem Steel, and we need to understand who this man was, because his personality shaped the company for the next 4 decades. Born 1862 in Williamsburg, Pennsylvania. Started as a stake driver for Andrew Carnegie's steel operation. Worked his way up through sheer force of personality and capability. By age 35, he was president of Carnegie Steel when J.P. Morgan bought Carnegie's operation and created U.S. Steel in 1901. Schwab became president of the largest corporation in the world. Annual salary, $1 million. In 1901 dollars, equivalent to about $35 million today. And he quit. Why? Because U.S. Steel was too bureaucratic, too slow, too concerned with stability rather than conquest. Schwab didn't want to manage. He wanted to build. He took control of Bethlehem Steel with a vision: transform it from a regional steel producer into an industrial colossus that could rival U.S. Steel itself, and he moved fast. Not cautious expansion, aggressive, almost reckless expansion. 1904, company reorganized as Bethlehem Steel Corporation, allowing it to issue stock and acquire companies at scale. 1905, acquisition of Pennsylvania Steel Company, giving Bethlehem access to new mills and ore deposits. 1906, to purchase of massive new shipyard facilities. 1908, investment in the gray beam mill, a revolutionary rolling technology. Let's pause on that last one, because it's crucial. The gray beam mill could produce wide-flanged structural beams, the I-beams that became the backbone of modern skyscraper construction. Before this, structural beams were built up from multiple pieces riveted together. Time-consuming, expensive, heavy. Wide-flanged beams were rolled as single pieces. Lighter, stronger, faster to install. And for years, Bethlehem had essentially a monopoly on producing them at scale. Think about what that means. Every architect designing a tall building in the 1910s and 1920s, every engineer planning a major bridge, they all needed wide-flanged beams. And there was really only one place to get them at the quality and quantity required. Bethlehem could name its price. Schwab also understood vertical integration in a way few of his contemporaries did. He didn't just want to make steel. He wanted to control every input that went into making steel. By 1910, Bethlehem owned iron ore mines in Pennsylvania and Cuba, coal mines in Pennsylvania, limestone quarries, coke ovens for processing coal, railroad lines connecting mines to mills, lake steamers for transporting ore, blast furnaces, open hearth furnaces, electric furnaces, rolling mills, forging shops, fabrication plants, shipyards in 4 states. This is vertical integration taken to its logical extreme. From ore in the ground to finished ship in the water, Bethlehem controlled it all. The advantages were real. Every supplier eliminated was margin saved. Every input controlled was a supply chain that couldn't be disrupted, but the costs were hidden, deferred. Each mine needed maintenance. Each furnace needed relining every few years at costs in the millions. Each facility employed hundreds or thousands of workers who would eventually retire with pensions. Schwab built a machine designed for infinite growth. Growth was the only setting it had, and for decades that would work perfectly. because what was coming next was the biggest war in human history, 1920s, 1930s. If you want to understand Bethlehem Steel's peak, you need to understand what was happening in America during these decades. The country was building upward. Not just buildings, monuments to ambition. Towers that redefined what was physically possible. 1931. The George Washington Bridge opens, spanning the Hudson River between Manhattan and New Jersey. At the time, the longest suspension bridge span in the world to 3,500 feet. Every piece of structural steel in those towers, every component in the anchorages, Bethlehem Steel. The bridge was designed by Othmar Ammann, one of the great bridge engineers of the century. He chose Bethlehem because when you're building something that's going to carry 300,000 vehicles per day, you don't take chances on steel quality. 1931. The Empire State Building completed, 102 stories, 1,250 feet to the top. Built in 410 days, that's one floor every 4 days on average. A speed that still seems impossible. The structural frame minus 60,000 tons of steel, almost entirely Bethlehem. Wide flange beams that could be erected faster than any previous. Skyscraper technology. There's a famous photograph from the construction. 5 workers sitting on a beam eating lunch, 800 feet above the street. No safety equipment. No harnesses. Just men on a steel beam in the sky. That beam was Bethlehem Steel, 1937. The Golden Gate Bridge opens. This one's special because the technical challenges were extraordinary. The bridge spans 4,200 feet across the Golden Gate Strait. The towers rise 746 feet above the water. The whole structure has to withstand winds up to 100 miles per hour, earthquakes, and salt corrosion from ocean spray. The steel had to be specified to tolerances that exceeded anything in the industry. Bethlehem bid on the contract and won because they could guarantee the quality at the scale. Required 80,000 miles of steel wire in the main cables. Thousands of tons of structural steel in the towers and deck. All from Bethlehem's mills. When the bridge opened, it was the longest and tallest suspension bridge in the world. It was also a statement. American engineering and American steel could accomplish anything. But here's what most people don't know. Bethlehem wasn't just supplying steel. They were engineering partners on many of these projects. Their metallurgists worked directly with architects and builders to develop specifications. Their engineers sometimes designed the steel components themselves. This created incredible customer loyalty. When you're planning a project where failure means deaths and lawsuits, you go with a supplier you trust. And in the 1920s and 30s, everyone trusted Bethlehem. The company's market position seemed unassailable. They had the technology, the capacity, the quality reputation, and the government contracts as a safety net. Workers knew they were building something that mattered. A steel worker in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania could take his kids to New York City and point at the skyline and say, "I made that. My hands were part of that." That's a different kind of job satisfaction than most people ever experience. Now we need to talk about the place that became both the symbol of Bethlehem's power and the anchor that would eventually drag it down. Sparrows Point, Maryland, 1916. When Bethlehem acquired the steelworks at Sparrows Point, they were buying what would become the largest steel production facility in the world. Let me give you the scale. 3,000 acres of industrial facility. That's nearly 5 square miles. For comparison, that's larger than some towns. The location was chosen for specific strategic reasons. Deep water port on the Chesapeake Bay, direct access to the Atlantic Ocean rail connections, to coal mines in West Virginia and Pennsylvania, close enough to Baltimore and Washington, D.C. for Workforce and markets. By the 1950s, Sparrows Point employed 35,000 workers. Not in the town, at the plant itself. 35,000 people showing up every day to make steel. The facility included 8 blast furnaces, each capable of producing 1,500 tons of molten iron per day, multiple open-hearth furnaces for steel-making rolling mills that could process everything from massive steel plate to thin sheets, a tin mill that made Sparrows Point the largest tin plate producer in the world, shipyards capable of building everything from ore carriers to naval vessels. Plant had its own power generating station, producing 400 megawatts. Its own water treatment plant processing 250 million gallons per day from the Chesapeake. Its own rail network, with 135 miles of track inside the plant grounds. Was a city dedicated entirely to transforming iron, ore and coal into steel. And it ran 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. If you stood at the center of Sparrows Point on a night shift in 1943, here's what you would experience. The noise first. A constant, overwhelming assault of sound. Blast furnaces roaring. Steam hammers pounding. Rolling mills screaming as red-hot steel passes through. Train whistles. Warning sirens. The whole thing combines into a mechanical thunder that you feel in your chest. The light, orange and white and yellow from furnaces and molten steel. Arc welders throwing lightning-bright flashes. The whole plant glows against the night sky like a small sun has been captured and put to work. The heat. Even standing 50 feet from a blast furnace, the radiant heat is enough to make your skin prickle. In summer, the interior of the buildings would reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Men worked in those conditions for 8-hour shifts, sometimes 12 if there was a rush order. The smell. Sulfur from the coke ovens. Hot metal, a distinct, almost sweet smell. Coal dust, oil from machinery, salt from the bay. It all mixed into an odor that got into your clothes, your hair, your lungs. Workers at Sparrows Point describe it in almost mythological terms. Like working inside a volcano that had been harnessed for industry. The company town that grew up around the plant was called, simply, Sparrows Point. Houses in neat rows. Company-owned housing where rent was deducted directly from paychecks. Company stores where workers bought groceries. A company hospital. Company baseball fields and recreation centers. In theory, this was paternalism. The company taking care of its workers. In practice, it was control. You worked for Bethlehem. You lived in a Bethlehem house. You bought from Bethlehem stores. You were paid in dollars that flowed right back to Bethlehem. But here's the thing. Most workers didn't resent it. The pay was good, significantly above average for industrial work. The benefits were solid. The pensions were real. A man could start at Sparrows Point at 18, work there for 40 years, retire with a pension that would support him and his wife for the rest of their lives. That was the promise. And for decades, Bethlehem kept it, but Sparrows Point was also a vulnerability. When you concentrate that much production capacity in one location, that location becomes a single point of failure. A strike at Sparrows Point could cripple the entire company. A recession that reduced demand meant 35,000 workers with not enough work to do. But Bethlehem still had to pay them or face union action. The very scale that made Sparrows Point powerful also made it inflexible. ***. December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor. The Japanese attack cripples the U.S. Pacific Fleet. 8 battleships sunk or damaged. Multiple cruisers and destroyers destroyed. Over 2,400 Americans dead. America enters World War II with a Navy that's been gutted. And we need to rebuild it while simultaneously fighting a two-ocean war. This is Bethlehem Steel's moment. The moment everything the company built, the furnaces, the mills, the shipyards, the decades of experience in military production converges into a single purpose: the man running. Bethlehem during the war was Eugene Grace. He'd been president since 1916, chairman since 1945. Grace lacked Schwab's charisma, but he was a production man, an operator. And in wartime, operators win. Grace made a commitment to the U.S. government that sounded like fantasy. Bethlehem Steel would deliver approximately one ship per day. Let that sink in. A modern warship is not a simple object. A destroyer in 1943 weighed 2,500 tons. It required hull plates 20 to 30 feet long, precisely shaped thousands of tons of structural components, engines, turbines, boilers, electrical systems, plumbing, ventilation, armor plate for critical areas, weapon mounts, and fire control systems. Building one is a marvel of industrial coordination. Building one per day is something no one had ever attempted. Bethlehem did it. And here's how. Production line shipbuilding. Taking principles from automotive manufacturing and applying them to ships. Prefabrication. Hull sections assembled in shops, then moved to the slipways for final assembly. Allowed parallel work streams instead of sequential 24/7 operations. 3 shifts. The shipyards never stopped. When one shift left, the next walked in and continued exactly where they left off. Workforce expansion. Bethlehem hired aggressively. And for the first time in the company's history, women entered the workforce in large numbers. By 1943, women made up about 15% of Bethlehem's workforce in some facilities. These weren't clerical jobs. Women were welding, operating cranes, reading blueprints, doing the same heavy industrial work men had always done. There's a photograph from Four River Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts. A young woman, maybe 25, in work clothes and a welding mask, working on the hull of a destroyer. The caption notes she could lay down a weld seam as good as any man in the yard. The numbers from this period are staggering. Bethlehem operated shipyards in Quincy, Massachusetts, Staten Island, New York, San Francisco, California, Sparrows Point, Maryland, and others. Over the course of the war, 1,121 vessels delivered destroyers, aircraft carriers, cargo ships, tankers, landing craft. This represented roughly 15% of total American naval construction during World War II. Peak production: 1 Liberty ship, cargo vessel. Every 30 days from a single yard. The scale is almost incomprehensible. Imagine standing at Sparrows Point Shipyard on any night in 1943. 6 ships under construction simultaneously, each one in a different stage. One just laid down, only the keel and bottom plates. Another half assembled, hull taking shape. Another nearly complete, workers installing weapons and equipment. Arc welders throwing white light across the hulls. Sparks cascading down into the black water of the Chesapeake. The smell of hot metal and welding flux. The constant percussion of air hammers. Overhead crane swinging steel plate that weighs 10 tons, placing it with precision measured in fractions of an inch. Riggers guiding the loads with hand signals because verbal communication was impossible over the noise. A banner stretched across the scaffolding. We build for victory, and they did. Those ships carried American troops across the Atlantic to Normandy. They escorted convoys through U-boat-infested waters. They fought in the Pacific, island by island, all the way to Japan. Bethlehem Steel didn't just contribute to winning the war. It was one of the mechanical prerequisites for victory, but there was a cost. 1 2-hour shifts were standard. In the shipyards, conditions were brutal. Confined spaces filled with welding fumes. Steel decks that were freezing in winter, scorching in summer. Noise levels that would be illegal by modern standards. The injury rates were horrific. Burns from welding. Lacerations from sharp metal. Crushed limbs from dropped loads. Falls from scaffolding. Flash blindness from arc welding without adequate protection. Every major shipyard had its own medical facility, essentially a small emergency room, not out of generosity, but necessity. The volume of injuries demanded it. And then there was the invisible damage. The coke ovens at Sparrows Point produced the processed coal needed for steelmaking. The men who worked those ovens were exposed to chemicals and particulates that would take decades to manifest as disease. Lung cancer, mesothelioma, chronic respiratory failure. By the 1970s and 80s, Bethlehem would face thousands of lawsuits from workers who'd been exposed to asbestos and other toxins during their careers. But in 1943, none of that mattered. What mattered was production. What mattered was that every week, more ships slid down the ways and into the water, ready to join the fleet. This was Bethlehem Steel's finest hour. The moment when the company's entire existence justified itself. When the decades of investment, expansion, and military relationship building paid off in the most dramatic way possible. Bethlehem Steel helped save the world. And then the war ended. And the question became, what do you do when the thing that made you essential is no longer needed? ** 1945. The war ends. The furnaces don't stop. America in the late 1940s and 1950s is experiencing something unprecedented. A peacetime boom of extraordinary scale. Soldiers come home. The GI Bill sends them to college. They get married. They have children, the baby boom. They buy houses in new suburbs that are sprouting up around every major city. And all of it needs steel. Houses, cars, appliances, office buildings, shopping centers. The interstate highway system authorized in 1956, 41,000 miles of highway requiring millions of tons of steel for bridges, overpasses, guardrails. Bethlehem Steel rides this wave with confidence. Production remains high. Employment stays robust. The union, the United Steelworkers, is one of the most powerful in the country. A steelworker in 1955 could earn $5,000 to $6,000 per year. That's equivalent to about $55,000 to $65,000 in today's dollars. With just a high school education, that wage could support a family of 4, buy a house, put a kid through college. Full pension after 30 years of service. Health care coverage, life insurance. These weren't optional benefits. They were guaranteed by union contracts. This was the American dream in its purest, industrial form. And because the system was working so well, nobody asked the hard questions. Is our cost structure sustainable if demand drops? What happens when our equipment ages and needs to be replaced? Are there competitors developing better technology? What if the world changes? In boardrooms and union halls alike, there was an unstated assumption. Steel demand is infinite. America will always need what we make. Our position is secure, but the world was already changing. Just slowly, quietly, in ways that wouldn't be obvious for years. **** Late 1950s. The first signals appear. They don't come as a crisis. They come as numbers on a spreadsheet. Import figures, price comparisons, market share percentages that shift by fractions of a point. Japanese steel. Here's what happened in Japan after World War II. The country's industrial capacity was destroyed, literally bombed into rubble. When you walked through Osaka or Tokyo in 1946, you saw steel mills reduced to twisted metal. Factories that were just empty shells. But destruction creates an opportunity. When you're rebuilding from zero, you don't rebuild the old way. You rebuild with the newest technology available. 1952. Japan Steel Works installs its first basic oxygen furnace, BAFA. This is a critical technological shift. Let me explain why. The old American mills, including Bethlehem, used open hearth furnaces for steelmaking. Open hearth technology dated back to the 1860s. You loaded iron, scrap, and flux into a large furnace, heated it with gas flames, and waited 8 to 12 hours for it to become steel. The basic oxygen furnace could do the same job in 40 minutes. It blasted pure oxygen through molten iron at supersonic speeds, burning out impurities in a fraction of the time. Result: higher productivity, lower energy costs, better quality control. By the early 1960s, Japan was building mills with basic oxygen furnaces, 40 minutes versus 10 hours per heat. Continuous casting poured steel directly into shapes instead of the old ingot process. Modern rolling mills with computer controls, integrated automation that reduced labor needs, and here's the kicker: Japan's labor costs were lower too. A Japanese steel worker in 1960 earned about 1/5 what an American steel worker earned. Add in better technology, and Japanese steel could be produced at roughly 60 to 70% of American costs. In 1960, Japan exported 2.6 million tons of steel to the United States. By 1970, 9.4 million tons. Then came European steel. West Germany rebuilt with Marshall Plan money and installed state-of-the-art equipment. The British Steel Corporation modernized. Brazil began developing its own industry. Every import contract was a small loss for Bethlehem. A few thousand tons here, a bid loss there. A customer who used to buy Bethlehem structural beams now buying Japanese beams at prices Bethlehem couldn't match without losing money. Individually, insignificant. Collectively, existential. But foreign competition was only half the problem. The other half was brewing right here in America. The mini-mill. To understand why mini-mills were so threatening, you need to understand what they weren't. They didn't need iron ore mines. They didn't need blast furnaces. They didn't need coke ovens. They didn't need miles of rail lines connecting raw material sources to production facilities. What they needed was scrap steel and electricity. The basic concept: take scrap steel, old cars, demolished buildings, industrial waste, melt it in an electric arc furnace, and reshape it into new products. The electric arc furnace uses electrodes that create an arc of electricity through the metal. Temperatures reach 30 degrees Fahrenheit. The scrap melts in 60 to 90 minutes. Advantages over an integrated mill like Bethlehem: capital costs 1/10 as much. Building a mini mill might cost $150 to $200 million in 1970s dollars. Building a new integrated mill, $2 to $3 billion. Operating costs 30 to 40% lower. No ore processing, no coking. No blast furnaces consuming massive amounts of energy. Workforce 75% smaller per ton of output. Modern mini mills employed about 1 worker per 1,000 tons of annual capacity. Integrated mills 4 to 5 workers per 1,000 tons. Location flexibility. You could build a mini mill anywhere you had scrap supply and electricity. You didn't need to be near ore deposits or shipping ports. No legacy costs. No pension obligations going back to the 1940s. No retiree health care. No aging equipment from the 1920s that needed constant maintenance. Early 1960s. The steel industry looked at mini mills and dismissed them. They can only make rebar and simple products, low quality stuff. Not a real threat. This was one of the great strategic miscalculations in American industrial history. The company that proved them wrong, Nucor. Founded in 1966, restructured from an older company. Headquartered in Charlotte, North Carolina, led by Ken Iverson, who understood that the future of steel wasn't in the massive integrated mills, but in small, efficient, focused operations. Nucor's strategy: build small mills, 200,000 to 400,000 tons capacity initially. In rural areas where land was cheap, focus on one product line per mill, pay workers based on productivity. If the mill produced more, workers earned more. Avoid unionization. By paying above union wages with better conditions, continuously invest in better technology, the quality gap closed faster than anyone expected. 1970s. Mini mills could make decent rebar and wire rod. 1980s. They could make structural shapes, competing directly with Bethlehem's bread and butter. 1990s. They could make sheet steel for cars. 2000s. They could make virtually anything, and every year. The cost advantage widened. By 1980, Nucor's cost per ton was roughly $50 to $70 less than Bethlehem's. On a product with margins of $100 to $150 per ton, that's devastating. Asterisk, asterisk. Here's the paradox that would kill Bethlehem Steel. The same vertical integration that made the company great in 1920 made it vulnerable in 1970. Let's do the math on Bethlehem's cost structure in the late 1970s. Fixed costs that had to be paid whether the mills ran at 100% capacity or 50%. Blast furnace maintenance. $100+ million annually pension obligations. $300+ million annually and growing. Retiree health care. $150+ million annually railroad maintenance. $50+ million annually property taxes on massive facilities. $40+ million annually ore mining operations. $200+ million annually total fixed costs. Over $800 million per year. Just to keep the lights on. Now compare that to a mini mill like Nucor. No blast furnaces to maintain minimal pension obligations, young workforce. No retiree health care burden yet. No railroads to maintain small facility footprint, low property taxes. No mining operations when demand was strong and mills ran at 90 to 100% capacity. Bethlehem's fixed costs spread across high volume meant competitive per ton costs. But when demand dropped and mills ran at 60 to 70% capacity, those same fixed costs became an anchor. The break-even point for Bethlehem's integrated operations was around 75 to 80% capacity utilization. Below that, they were losing money. Nucor could be profitable at 50% capacity. And demand was dropping. 1974. First oil crisis. Energy costs spike. Construction slows. Steel demand drops. 1979. Second oil crisis. Recession. Demand drops again. 1980-1982. Deep recession. Construction nearly stops. Automotive production plummets. Bethlehem's management could see the problem. Internal reports from the late 1970s show they understood. Technology gap with foreign competitors. Cost disadvantage versus mini mills, aging equipment needing replacement, rising fixed costs, but understanding. A problem and solving it are completely different things. What do you do when replacing your blast furnaces costs $2 billion and you don't have $2 billion? What do you do when your furnaces are 50 years old and breaking down constantly, but shutting them down for months to rebuild means massive losses? What do you do when cutting workforce triggers a union strike that costs more than the savings? What do you do when your pension obligations are legally binding contracts that you can't renegotiate? You make reasonable decisions. Cut discretionary spending. Delay maintenance where you can. Negotiate labor contracts that slow wage growth. Close the least efficient plants. Try to hold on until demand rebounds. And none of it is enough. Because the fundamental equation has changed. Your cost structure was built for a world where you were the low-cost producer with the best technology. That world no longer exists, and the gap between what you need to spend to modernize and what you can afford to spend grows every quarter. The math is turning against you. And math doesn't care about your history or your importance. Math just compounds. Asterisk asterisk. By the late 1970s, workers at Bethlehem could feel it. The anxiety, the uncertainty. Orders were down. Mills that used to run 3 shifts were down to 2. Then 1. Talk of layoffs. Early retirement packages offered to senior workers to reduce headcount. In towns like Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and Sparrows Point, Maryland, the mood shifted. These communities had lived on steel for generations. Your grandfather worked at the plant. Your father worked there. You worked there. Your son was supposed to work there. It was more than employment. It was identity. It was the fabric of the community. People remember walking past the plant gates in 1980 and seeing men they'd worked with for 20 years being told they were laid off. Not because they'd done anything wrong. Not because they weren't good workers. Just because there wasn't enough work. And here's what made it worse. There was nowhere else to go. Bethlehem, Pennsylvania in 1980 wasn't a diversified economy. It was a steel town. If you weren't working at Bethlehem Steel, your options were limited. The local businesses, restaurants, shops, services, all depended on steelworker wages. When the steelworkers got laid off, the whole economy contracted. But the real crisis was still ahead. Asterisk asterisk 1982, the year that shattered the illusion. Bethlehem. Steel reports a loss of $1.50 billion in $1,982. Adjust for inflation to today, roughly $4.7 billion. In 1 year. To put that in perspective, that's more money than many Fortune 500 companies earn in revenue in a year. Bethlehem didn't just fail to make a profit. They burned through $1.5 billion. What happened? Everything. All at once. The perfect storm. The economy. Deep recession. The worst since the Great Depression. Unemployment hits 10.8% nationally. Construction nearly stops. Automotive production down 30%. Every major steel customer is cutting back. Foreign competition. Japanese and European steel flooding the market. In 1982, imports captured 21.8% of the American steel market, the highest ever. The dollar. The U.S. dollar is strong against foreign currencies, making American exports expensive and imports cheap. Bethlehem steel costs 30 to 40% more than imported steel just because of exchange rates. Energy costs. Oil prices spiked in 1979 to 1980. Natural gas prices up. Electricity costs up. Every ton of steel Bethlehem makes requires massive energy inputs. Those costs can't be passed on to customers when demand is weak, and the fixed costs keep grinding away regardless. Blast furnaces still need maintenance. Pensions still have to be paid. Retiree health care still has to be provided. Property taxes still come due. The company is bleeding cash. They've borrowed heavily to try to modernize some facilities. Now they're paying interest on that debt while revenue collapses. Bethlehem's response. Emergency contraction. Plants closed. Los Angeles facility shut down. 1,500 workers laid off. Seattle facility shut down. 800 workers laid off. Major cutbacks at Lackawanna, New York plant. 4,000 workers laid off. Total employment at Bethlehem Steel drops from over 100,000 in 1979 to about 75,000 by 1983. But here's the cruelest part. The cuts don't fix the problem. They just slow the bleeding because the fundamental economics haven't changed. Bethlehem's cost per ton is still higher than competitors. The technology gap is still there. The fixed costs are still crushing. And now they've also damaged their production capacity. When demand does eventually recover, they won't be able to fulfill large orders as quickly. They've cut muscle, not just fat. Let's zoom in on what this meant in human terms. Lackawanna, New York. 1983. Lackawanna is a town of about 20,000 people just south of Buffalo. It exists because of Bethlehem Steel. The plant was built in 1903. For 80 years, it was the economic engine of the community. At its peak, the Lackawanna plant employed 20,000 workers. That's every working-age adult in the town and many from surrounding communities. Then come the layoffs. December 1983. Bethlehem announces it's shutting down major portions of the Lackawanna plant. 7,000 workers will lose their jobs. Most are permanent layoffs, not temporary. Imagine you're one of those workers. You're 45 years old. You've worked at that plant since you were 18, 27 years. You know every process, every machine, every guy on your shift. You thought you had 20 years left until retirement. Full pension, health care. The promise. Now, you're walking out those gates for the last time with a severance check that'll last maybe 6 months if you're careful. And you're thinking, what now? You're a skilled steel worker. But there are 7,000 other skilled steel workers looking for work. And Lackawanna doesn't have 7,000 other jobs. Buffalo's economy is struggling too. Maybe you could move. But you're 45. Your parents live here. Your kids are in school here. Your house is here, and it's now worth half what you paid for it because everyone knows Lackawanna's dying. So this is what happens. You take whatever work you can find, maybe retail for $4 an hour instead of the $15 you were making. Maybe construction, but that's seasonal. Maybe nothing at all. Your wife, who maybe didn't work before because your salary was enough, now has to find work too. You cut everything. No more eating out. No vacation. Put off car repairs. Medical checkups delayed. The restaurant where you used to have Friday dinners? They close. Not enough customers. The hardware store where you bought supplies? Going out of business. The local tax base collapses. The school district has to cut programs. Roads don't get repaired. This isn't economic theory. This is what happened in Lackawanna. In Johnstown, Pennsylvania. In Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, there's a term economists use, economic depression in a single industry community. It means when one employer dominates a town and that employer fails, the entire community enters depression-level conditions, even if the national economy is fine. Unemployment in Lackawanna in 1984, over 25%. That's Great Depression numbers. People who lived through it describe a sense of betrayal. Not anger at specific people necessarily, but betrayal by the system. They told us if we worked hard, showed up on time, did our jobs, we'd be taken care of. That was the deal. And they broke it. That quote is from a documentary interview with a former Bethlehem steel worker. And it captures something important. The psychological impact wasn't just about money. It was about a broken promise. A broken covenant between labor and capital that had defined the post-war industrial economy. After the 1982 disaster, Bethlehem Steel entered what can only be called a managed decline. Or more accurately, a slow collapse that management tried to control but couldn't. The pattern repeats over 18 years. Cut costs gives temporary stabilization, gives market conditions worsen, gives cut more costs gives. Deeper trouble 1985, Bethlehem sells its railroad operations. 132 miles of track connecting plants to main lines, $140 million in cash, but they now have to pay another railroad to ship their materials. 1986. Exit from residential construction steel. Too competitive. Too low margin. 1987. Negotiations with unions to reduce wages and benefits in exchange for job security. Workers accept a wage freeze. Jobs aren't secured. 1989. Another major loss. $463 million. 1991. Emergency loan from banks to avoid bankruptcy. $1.2 billion. The banks require major concessions. More cuts. More closures. 1992. The Johnstown plants close. This one resonates because of Johnstown's history. The town was already legendary for the 1889 flood that killed over 2,200 people. The community rebuilt around steel. Bethlehem's presence in Johnstown went back decades. Now, permanent closure. 3,000 workers gone. 1995. Steel production ends at the Bethlehem, Pennsylvania plant. This is the symbolic death. The origin. The place where it all started in 1857. For 138 years, steel was made in Bethlehem, continuously, through wars, depressions, market cycles. Now the last furnace goes cold. The last heat of steel is poured. Then silence. Walk through that plant in 1996 and you see something that looks post-apocalyptic. Buildings designed for 24/7 operation sitting empty. Equipment worth millions just sitting there, rusting. The smell of rust and stale oil. Puddles of water from leaking roofs. Broken windows. The only sounds are wind, rain, and occasionally pigeons nesting in the rafters. 1997. Bethlehem exits shipbuilding entirely. The shipyards that built over 1,100 warships during World War II sold. The capability that was arguably Bethlehem's greatest contribution to American history abandoned. This was presented as strategic focus. We're concentrating on our core steel business. But the truth was simpler. Everything they could sell to raise cash was being sold. By 2000, Bethlehem Steel employed fewer than 13,000 people, down from 300,000. At peak, the company that once operated across multiple states now ran just a handful of mills at reduced capacity. Asterisk. Here's the arithmetic that made Bethlehem's situation impossible. Annual pension and retiree health care obligations as of 2000. $1.8 billion annual revenue from steel operations. $2.10 billion operating costs, raw materials, energy, labor, maintenance. $2 billion. Do that math. $2.1 billion revenue. $2 billion operating costs equals $100 million. Left to cover $1.8 billion in pension healthcare obligations. The shortfall. $1.7 billion per year, and there was no way to close that gap. You can't cut pension obligations, they're legally guaranteed. You can't dramatically cut operating costs without shutting down production entirely. You can't raise prices because you're already not competitive with imports and many mills. This is the endgame of a system failure. All roads lead to the same place, bankruptcy. The only question was when, not if. October 15, 2001. Barely a month after the September 11th attacks had shocked the nation and sent the economy reeling. Bethlehem Steel filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The filing was not a surprise. Industry analysts had been predicting it for years. The company's quarterly reports told the story, plainly for anyone who could read a balance sheet. But there's a difference between knowing something intellectually and experiencing it. Emotionally. For the 12,000 workers still employed at Bethlehem's remaining plants, the bankruptcy was a formality confirming what they'd feared for years. The company was dead. Chapter 11 was just the funeral. The bankruptcy filing showed the scale of the disaster. Total assets, $4.4 billion. Total liabilities, $6.3 billion. Debt, $1.9 billion shortfall. Pension underfunding, $3.7 billion. Retiree healthcare unfunded liability, $1.9 billion. Think about those numbers. Bethlehem owed its retirees $5.6 billion more than it had set aside to pay them. Even if you could sell every asset at full value, there wasn't enough money to cover the promises. Chapter 11 bankruptcy is supposed to allow companies to reorganize, renegotiate contracts, shed unprofitable operations, emerge leaner and competitive. But Bethlehem's problems weren't fixable through reorganization. The fundamental issue, cost structure uncompetitive with modern mills, massive legacy obligations, aging equipment needing billions in investment, couldn't be solved by a bankruptcy judge. The company stayed in bankruptcy for 2 years. Tried to find a buyer. Tried to restructure. Nothing worked. May 2003. Bethlehem Steel's assets are sold to International Steel Group, ISG, a company formed by investor Wilbur Ross specifically to acquire distressed American steel companies. Purchase price, $1.5 billion. Let me put that in perspective. At its peak, Bethlehem Steel's market capitalization exceeded $10 billion in inflation-adjusted dollars. The physical assets alone, the mills, the equipment, the real estate, were worth far more than $1.5 billion. But in a bankruptcy liquidation, assets sell for whatever someone's willing to pay. And Ross was the only serious bidder. Here's what ISG got for $1.5 billion. Burns Harbor Facility, Indiana. Modern mill. 1970s vintage, actually competitive. Sparrows Point, Maryland. Massive facility. Mostly outdated but valuable location. Steelton, Pennsylvania. Plate mill operation. Various other smaller operations. Here's what ISG didn't take: the pension obligations, the retiree healthcare obligations, the closed plants and contaminated industrial sites, the company's history, its name, its identity. Those obligations, they went to the federal government. Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, PBGC, the federal agency that insures private sector pensions, took over Bethlehem. Steel's pension obligations. It was one of the largest pension defaults in American history. 95,000 retirees and workers with vested pensions were affected. Now, PBGC doesn't just pay whatever the company promised. They have maximum limits. In 2003, the maximum PBGC pension for someone who retired at 65 was about $44,000 per year. Here's the problem: many Bethlehem Steel retirees, particularly senior managers and long-service workers, had been promised pensions above that limit, some significantly above. A plant manager who retired in 1998 with a promised pension of $65,000 per year would now receive the PBGC maximum, $44,000, a cut of $21,000 annually. Over a 20-year retirement, that's $420,000 in lost benefits. And retiree health care? PBGC doesn't cover that at all. 95,000 retirees and their spouses lost their company-provided health insurance. For a 70-year-old retiree on a fixed pension, suddenly having to pay for health care out of pocket could mean $8,000 to $12,000 per year in additional costs. That can be the difference between living comfortably and living in poverty. The human stories are Devastating. A retired crane operator in his 70s. Interviewed in 2004. I worked 42 years for that company. They promised me health care for life. Now I'm choosing between prescriptions and groceries. A widow of a steel worker who died from asbestosis contracted at the plant. His pension was $2,400 a month. Now I get $1,600, and I lost the health insurance. He gave his lungs to that company, and this is what we get. These weren't people who'd been lazy or careless with money. These were people who'd done everything right according to the rules of the mid-20th century industrial economy. Work hard, be loyal, trust the company, accept lower wages during your working years in exchange for security in retirement. And the system broke the promises, the federal cost. PBGC's takeover of Bethlehem's pensions ultimately cost American taxpayers approximately $7.3 billion. That's the amount PBGC had to pay to cover the underfunded pensions. So in the end, the cost of Bethlehem Steel's collapse was socialized, spread across all Americans through the federal pension insurance system. Asterisk, asterisk, this is important to understand. Because the human instinct when confronted with a disaster of this scale is to look for someone to blame. So who was responsible? The CEOs who took high salaries while the company was failing? Sure, you can criticize them. But their compensation, while large, was tiny compared to the billions in losses. The workers who demanded high wages and benefits? But those wages were negotiated in good faith and were actually essential to maintain skilled workforce. The unions that resisted change? But the changes management proposed, wage cuts, benefit reductions, wouldn't have fixed the fundamental cost structure problem. The government for allowing imports? But protectionism would have raised costs for American manufacturers who needed steel and likely triggered trade wars. The investors who pushed for short-term profits? But even if management had taken a longer view, they didn't have the capital to compete with mills that had been built with more modern technology. Here's the truth. The failure was structural, not personal. Bethlehem Steel was built for a specific era, an era of American industrial dominance, limited foreign competition, growing domestic demand, and long capital cycles. That era ended in the 1970s. The company needed to transform from a vertically integrated 19th century steel giant into a modern, efficient producer. That transformation would have required closing most existing facilities, building new mills with modern technology, cost $10 to $15 billion, eliminating 80% of workforce, breaking union contracts, defaulting on pension promises, abandoning towns that depended on them. All of this would need to happen while still competing with imports and mini-mills that already had the cost advantage. It was mathematically impossible. The system that built Bethlehem Steel's success, vertical integration, massive scale, long-term obligations, lifetime employment, became the system that made adaptation impossible. It's not that no one saw it coming. Internal reports from the 1970s show management understood the competitive threat. But understanding a problem and being able to solve it within the constraints you're operating under are completely different things. Asterisk, asterisk today. If you visit Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, you can still see them. 5 blast furnaces, each one rising over 100 feet into the sky, rusted the color of dried blood. They haven't made steel in 30 years. When the plant closed in 1995, there was enormous pressure to demolish these structures. They're industrial relics. They occupy prime real estate along the Lehigh River. The land could be redeveloped for housing, offices, shopping. Every conventional economic argument pointed toward demolition. Tear them down. Clean the site. Start over. But the furnaces stayed. Why? because enough people in Bethlehem understood that these structures are not just old equipment. Their memory, their testimony, their physical proof that something extraordinary happened here, that this small Pennsylvania town was once the industrial heart of American power, that the steel that holds up the Golden Gate Bridge, the Empire State Building, that protected American sailors in 2 world wars, it was born in these furnaces. In 2011. The site reopened as steel stacks. Not a museum. Not exactly a memorial. An arts and cultural campus built in the shadow of the old furnaces, concert venues, festival grounds, a PBS television station, restaurants, public gathering spaces. The blast furnaces are illuminated at night with colored LED lights that shift and pulse, blue, purple, orange. A mechanical aurora borealis. The juxtaposition is powerful, almost surreal. Where molten iron once ran at 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit, families eat ice cream on summer evenings. Where the noise once made men deaf, a folk singer plays acoustic guitar. Where the air tasted like sulfur and hot metal, kids play in a public park, but the furnaces remain massive, undeniable, physical evidence of what used to be. People call them steel cathedrals, and the term is accurate. There's something sacred about standing beneath these structures. Not religious sacred, but a sense of awe at the scale of human ambition and effort they represent. You stand at the base of a blast furnace and look up. The structure towers over you. The rust has patterns, streaks and colors where different metals oxidized differently. You can see where repairs were welded in place, where ladders once gave access to platforms 80 feet up, and you think about the fact that this furnace ran continuously for decades, never stopping. Men feeding it ore and coke and limestone, heat that could melt rock, molten iron pouring out like lava 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. It's a monument to industrial ambition, and a warning about its limits. Asterisk. Here's something important to understand. Steel didn't disappear. The world uses more steel today than it did at Bethlehem Steel's peak. Much more. Global steel production, 1970, near Bethlehem's peak, 600 million tons. 2023, 1.9 billion tons. So it's not that the world stopped needing steel. It's that the world stopped needing Bethlehem steel specifically. Where is steel made now? China, 1.0 billion tons per year, more than half of global production. Massive government-supported mills using the most modern technology. India, 140 million tons. Growing rapidly. Japan, 90 million tons. The country that helped kill the American integrated mills is now struggling with the same problems. Aging facilities, high costs, competition from China. United States, 80 million tons. But only about 30% from integrated mills. The rest from mini-mills. Companies like Nucor and Steel Dynamics now dominate American steel production. They use electric arc furnaces, produce at lower cost, employ far fewer workers per ton. The American steel industry exists. It's just unrecognizable compared to what Bethlehem Steel represented. The lesson: the product survived. The system that produced it did not. Asterisk. Bethlehem Steel's story is not unique. It's a pattern that's repeated across American industry. General Motors dominated auto industry for decades, burdened by legacy costs and pension obligations. Filed bankruptcy 2009. Kodak invented digital photography. Couldn't abandon film business fast enough. Bankruptcy 2012. Sears, largest retailer in America for generations, failed to adapt to changing retail landscape. Bankruptcy 2018. The pattern is consistent. Success creates rigidity. The company builds systems optimized for current conditions. Those systems work brilliantly. Scale, integration, market dominance. Scale creates obligations, workforces, pensions, communities, infrastructure, fixed costs that seemed reasonable when growth was assured. The world changes. Technology advances. Competitors emerge. Customer preferences shift. Regulations change. The company can see the change coming. Management isn't blind. Reports document the threats, but the system can't adapt fast enough. The very size and integration that created success now prevents transformation. Too many stakeholders, too much debt, too little capital for the investment needed. Reasonable decisions compound into disaster. Each individual decision, cut here, delay there, negotiate this contract, makes sense in isolation. Collectively, they're inadequate. The math becomes impossible. Eventually, fixed costs exceed the company's ability to generate revenue. No amount of clever management can fix this. Collapse becomes inevitable. Not overnight, slowly, predictably. While everyone watches, this is not about incompetence. It's about the physics of large systems. Large systems have momentum. That momentum is beneficial when the environment is stable. But when the environment changes, momentum becomes inertia. The thing that helped you keep going in one direction prevents you from changing direction. ** 2024. Sparrows Point, Maryland. The massive steel facility that once employed 35,000 workers is now partially demolished, partially repurposed. Some of the land is being redeveloped. Some sits contaminated, waiting for environmental cleanup. The community of Sparrows Point still exists, but it's a ghost of what it was. Property values never recovered. Many of the company houses are abandoned or in disrepair. The retirees, many of the Bethlehem Steel workers who lost pensions and health care in 2003 are still alive. They're in their 70s and 80s now, living on reduced pensions. Many couldn't afford to stay in their homes. There are support groups, communities of former steel workers who meet to share stories and help each other navigate the complexities of Social Security, Medicare, and inadequate pensions. The environmental legacy. Bethlehem Steel's facilities left behind contaminated land. Decades of steel production left heavy metals in soil, PCBs, asbestos, contaminated groundwater. Cleanup costs in the hundreds of millions, much of it paid by taxpayers through Superfund. The social legacy. Towns like Bethlehem, Johnstown, Lackawanna have never fully recovered. They've diversified to some extent, healthcare, education, service industries. But they lost their economic engine and their identity. Median household income in these towns is 20 to 30% below state averages. Poverty rates higher. Educational attainment lower. When a company that defined a community for 100+ years disappears, the effects persist for generations. So what does Bethlehem Steel's story teach us? Not a simple moral. Not greed is bad, or unions destroyed American manufacturing, or foreign competition is unfair. The lesson is more subtle and more important. Dominance is not durability. Being essential today doesn't guarantee you'll be essential tomorrow. Being large doesn't make you invincible. Sometimes it makes you vulnerable. The world doesn't owe you continuity. Markets change. Technology advances. Competitors emerge. The rules shift. The fact that you succeeded brilliantly under one set of conditions doesn't mean you'll succeed under different conditions. Scale has costs that don't appear on quarterly reports. Every worker you hire is a future obligation. Every facility you build is future maintenance. Every promise you make restricts your future flexibility. These costs can take decades to manifest, but they're real, Adaptation requires capital and flexibility. To transform when the world changes requires massive investment and the ability to make hard choices. If you've spent all your capital maintaining your existing system and tied yourself to obligations you can't escape, you may not be able to adapt even if you see the need. For modern companies, ask, are we building systems that only work under current conditions? Are we making promises we might not be able to keep in 30 years? Are we so focused on our current business that we can't see threats emerging? If we needed to transform completely, do we have the capital and flexibility to do it? These questions matter, because Bethlehem Steel's story isn't ancient history. It's a warning. It's evidence that even the mightiest enterprises, even the companies that seem too essential to fail, can disappear when the fundamentals change. Asterisk, asterisk, a summer evening at Steel Stacks, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. 1,000 people gathered beneath the old blast furnaces, families, couples, children, listening to music, eating, laughing, living in the afterlife of an industrial empire. The colored lights shift across the rusted steel, blue to purple to orange. A slow mechanical pulse against structures that haven't moved in decades. The sky above Bethlehem is clear, clearer than it's been in 140 years. No smoke, no haze, no orange glow from furnaces running through the night. The bones remain. Steel doesn't disappear. It just stops moving. These furnaces produced millions of tons of steel, built bridges that still stand, buildings that still rise, ships that won a war, and then, slowly, predictably, inexorably, the system that made it all possible ground to a halt. Not because of a villain, not because of a scandal, because the world changed and the system couldn't. Standing beneath these structures, you feel scale, you feel time. You feel the accumulated weight of 140 years of human ambition and labor compressed into rust and silence. A monument and a warning that dominance is temporary, that necessity is conditional, that even the strongest systems can fail when the assumptions they're built on change. The furnaces stand there, massive and undeniable, waiting for someone to walk beneath them and wonder, what did it sound like when they were building the world?